In the decades following the assassination of Julius Caesar, the Roman world tore itself apart. The Republic, already hollowed out by a century of civil war, fractured into competing power centers, each controlled by men who believed history had chosen them to determine Rome's future. From this crucible of ambition and violence, two figures emerged whose partnership would become one of the most consequential and ultimately catastrophic alliances the ancient world had ever witnessed. Their story is not simply a love affair set against a backdrop of war. It is the story of two empires, two competing visions of world order, and two extraordinary individuals whose personal bond would seal the fate of nations. This is the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Marcus Antonius was, by any measure, one of the most formidable men of his age. A descendant of the great Hercules, by his own proud claim, he had built his reputation on the battlefield and in the forums of Rome with equal facility. He was physically imposing, famously generous, and possessed of a charisma that inspired fierce personal loyalty. But Antony was also impulsive, given to excess, and incapable of the cold, calculating patience that would ultimately define his rival. He had been Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, the man who stood before the Roman mob and turned the tide of history with a single funeral oration. When Caesar fell in 44 BC, Antony was the most powerful man in the Roman world. That position would not last. Within months, the young Gaius Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, barely 19 years old, arrived in Rome to claim his inheritance. Antony dismissed him contemptuously at first. He would not make the same mistake twice, but the damage was already done. The two men were bound together by necessity and separated by everything else. In 43 BC, they formed the Second Triumvirate with Marcus Lepidus, dividing the Roman world between them. But the arrangement was never designed to last. It was always a temporary truce between men who could not coexist. The Triumvirate first turned its violence inward, unleashing the Proscriptions, mass executions of political enemies that claimed among their victims the great orator Cicero, whose severed head Antony reportedly had displayed in the Forum. Rome watched, terrified and compliant. Then, in 42 BC, Antony and Octavian crushed the forces of Caesar's assassins at the twin battles of Philippi in Macedonia, eliminating Brutus and Cassius and ending the last serious republican resistance. The Roman world now belonged to two men, and the question was simply which one would survive. Antony took the East, the wealthiest, most culturally sophisticated half of the Roman Empire. He established himself in Athens, then in the great cities of Asia Minor, living with the pomp and ceremony of a Hellenistic king. It was in this context that he summoned Cleopatra VII to meet him at Tarsus in 41 BC. He expected a client monarch come to explain her allegiances. What arrived was something else entirely. Cleopatra had ruled Egypt for nearly 2 decades. She was not simply a queen, but a pharaoh, a living goddess in the tradition of 3,000 years of civilization. She spoke 9 languages, the only Ptolemaic ruler in history to bother learning Egyptian, and had already understood that survival in a world being swallowed by Rome required more than diplomacy. It required mastery of the Romans themselves. She had played that game with Julius Caesar, borne him a son, and watched him die. She arrived at Tarsus aboard a gilded barge, attended by servants dressed as cupids, the entire spectacle calculated for precise political effect. Antony, who liked to present himself as the new Dionysus, encountered in Cleopatra someone who understood the performance of power as well as he did. They spent that winter together in Alexandria, founding what the ancient sources describe as an association they called the Inimitable Livers, a society devoted to banqueting, spectacle, and the studied enjoyment of everything life could offer. It was, beneath its surface glamour, an alliance of mutual need dressed in the language of pleasure. But the world would not stay still. Antony's wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius launched an armed rebellion against Octavian in Italy in 41 BC, forcing Antony to return west. Fulvia died before the two men could come to open conflict, and in 40 BC, Antony cemented peace with Octavian through the Treaty of Brundisium, sealed by his marriage to Octavian's sister, Octavia, a woman of exemplary virtue and genuine political worth. For several years, the arrangement held. Antony ruled the East and fought successful campaigns against the Parthians. He was a Roman general still, anchored to Roman obligations. But Octavian was building something durable in the West, a settlement, a narrative, a legend of order restored. Antony was building something more complicated. In 37 BC, Antony returned to Cleopatra. He acknowledged their twin children, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, born years earlier, and the following year, at the ceremony the Romans called the Donations of Alexandria, he distributed vast territories of the Eastern Empire to Cleopatra and her children, naming her Queen of Kings, appointing Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, as co-ruler of Egypt. He divorced Octavia. In Rome, the effect was catastrophic. Octavian had waited for precisely this moment. The propaganda war that followed was ruthless in its precision. Octavian portrayed Antony not as a Roman general who had made political errors, but as a man unmanned, a Roman who had surrendered himself to an Eastern queen, who had forgotten his gods, his duties, and his identity. He read Antony's will publicly in Rome, claiming it proved Antony intended to move the capital to Alexandria and hand the Roman world to a foreign dynasty. Whether the will was genuine or fabricated matters less than the effect it produced. Rome turned against Antony. In 32 BC, Octavian declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. The distinction was deliberate. The two sides gathered the largest fleets the Mediterranean world had seen in a generation. In the summer of 31 BC, they met off the western coast of Greece at a place called Actium. What followed was not the clean clash of great fleets that history might have demanded. Antony's forces were weakened by desertion, disease, and the corrosive effect of months spent in a malarial camp, waiting for Octavian to force a decision. His officers were abandoning him. His sailors were dying. And on the 2nd of September, as the battle developed and the outcome hung uncertain, Cleopatra's squadron broke through and fled south toward Egypt. Antony, seeing her ships depart, followed. Whether this was a planned breakout or an impulsive choice that ended the battle, no one can say with certainty. His fleet, leaderless and outmaneuvered, surrendered. His legions on land followed days later. What happened next would change everything. Octavian advanced on Egypt. City by city, Antony's remaining forces melted away or surrendered. Antony received false reports that Cleopatra was dead. On the 1st of August, 30 BC, he fell on his sword. He was not immediately successful and lay dying when word came that Cleopatra still lived. He was brought to her and died in her arms in the mausoleum where she had barricaded herself. Cleopatra survived him by 11 days. When Octavian made clear that she would be paraded through Rome in his triumph, the ultimate humiliation, a queen displayed in chains before a jeering crowd, she chose her own death. The ancient sources describe an asp smuggled in with a basket of figs. She was 39 years old. Octavian, who would soon take the name Augustus, executed Caesarion, the last potential rival with Caesar's blood. He annexed Egypt as his personal province, locking its vast treasury into the Roman state. The Roman Republic was now, in all but name, an empire. One man stood at its center, and the world he built would endure for centuries. The story of Antony and Cleopatra is often told as a tragedy of passion overwhelming reason. But the reality is both more human and more complex. They were two politicians operating at the limits of what their world permitted, in an age when every alliance was also a gamble and every choice contained the seed of catastrophe. What destroyed them was not love, but the asymmetry of their position, the fact that the Roman world, even at the height of its instability, was never quite ready to accept what they represented. They had imagined a different kind of world, one poised between Rome and the East, between republic and monarchy, between one civilization and another. Octavian's genius was in understanding that the Roman people did not want that world. They wanted the one he was offering. The lovers of Alexandria were buried together. The location of their tomb has never been found.